Today, I'm going to show you how to use Claude Code to modify Docker configuration so that you can confidently use Docker in your own coding projects. Today, I'll integrate 3 separate projects: the NCA Toolkit, a powerful media processing API, MinIO, an S3 file storage engine, and N8N, a powerful automation platform. We'll create a Docker Compose file that allows us to run all 3 of these applications together locally on our computer for free. All right, so let's get started. These are the 2 tasks that we have to do in order to get the No-Code Architects Toolkit to work locally on your own computer. We have to get MinIO working locally in coordination with the No-Code Architects Toolkit. And just remember, the No-Code Architects Toolkit is an API that allows you to do advanced media processing for video and audio and a bunch of other tools and captioning your videos. But it does require a place to deliver those files when it's done. So after it generates a movie file or a MP4 or a captioned video, it needs a storage engine to drop that file. And typically it uses S3, which was developed by Amazon AWS. But then there's a bunch of other platforms that have cloned this protocol like DigitalOcean. And typically what it requires is that you can connect up to one of those S3 providers. But when you run locally and you're doing this all within your home network on your computer, you're not going to be able to access, well, actually, technically you could, but if we're trying to reduce the costs so that we can run this locally for free, then we basically have to launch our own compatible S3 system. And that's what MinIO does. So I do encourage you to check out MinIO and read what it's all about. But for now, let's go ahead and get this started. All right, so now to get started, I want to show you some of the logic here that I'm going to use to design this to work locally, because we already have some of the pieces that we need. But the way the toolkit is built right now, or at least the files that we provide, it is for hosting on the web. So you're going to launch a server somewhere like on DigitalOcean or on Google Cloud Platform or some sort of server host. And we've given you the instructions on how to set that up there. So we have the Docker file, which is a file that explains to Docker how to build the image that it can use to run and execute the toolkit. And then there's also this Docker Compose file, which helps orchestrate a couple of different processes in order to run this on the web. So when you deploy Docker on the web, so you've got a server here and you want to access it from your browser, you have to use SSL. This is the little lock in your browser that makes everything secure. So in order to make that seamless and easy, and something that you might not even be aware of, is that a lot of Docker files end up using this platform here, which automatically creates an SSL certificate for you and sets up all the ports and all the networking kind of behind the scenes so that you don't have to do it. And then it also connects up that with the NCA Toolkit. So there's actually 2 processes getting built here in this Docker file. And I would encourage you to just take some of these files here. I'm going to jump over to Claude and ask Claude questions. So I basically just said, hey, can you help explain this Docker Compose file and what it actually does in very simple language? Give me a brief answer, and then I can ask more questions as needed. Sometimes I say that just because it goes on and on and on, and it's easier to just ask more questions if you don't understand. But I'm just going to ask this question and pass in the actual Docker Compose file. And it's going to break it down to you as to what it does. And I think it's a smart exercise to go through because you can learn a lot along the way. Because if you're just copying and pasting files off the internet and you're not really learning how these things work, you're going to get by. But the more you understand ports and how things are accessed and like what Let's Encrypt does, Let's Encrypt is actually a really cool tool. 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember exactly the time, you used to have to spend $100 to $200 every time you wanted an SSL certificate, which is what gives you the little lock on your browser. And when Let's Encrypt came out, they created a free way to generate those SSL certificates. And then this image here is what uses Let's Encrypt and sets all this up for us. But if we're running this locally, we don't need this because nobody's going to be accessing this from the outside. So instead of using HTTPS, which is the way we do things securely on the web, we can just use HTTP. We can avoid this altogether. And then we need to set up MinIO. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into my terminal here. I already have the No-Code Architects Toolkit GitHub repository downloaded, and I'm on the build branch, which is the branch that I use to actually make changes. We do all of our testing here on the build branch. And then once everything is confirmed, we move it into the main branch. So what I'm going to be doing here is trying to build a new Docker Compose file here that is for local installs that also uses MinIO and also builds the connection between the NCA Toolkit and the min.io server with a Docker Compose file so that it connects everything up, so that the NCA Toolkit and min.io can function together so that the toolkit has a place to drop its files. Again, remember, this is going to simulate the S3 environment, but it's just going to be running locally on our computer. And then that way we can have a zero cost install of the NCA Toolkit. We can run it just on our computer and we don't have to worry about any fees whatsoever for hosting. I'm going to jump over here. I'm going to close this current project. We'll go ahead and open a new project, open NCA Toolkit. There we go. Just going to make sure I'm on the build branch, git, checkout, build. We're good to go. So now I'm just going to go into Claude Code. Go ahead and close these open files. I'll open up the Docker Compose file, open up Claude Code. And now what I want to do here is just going to explain to it what we want to do. And then we're just going to explain what we need to do here. We've got our existing Docker file and our Docker Compose, which is meant to deploy on a cloud server with an S3 provider. Could be DigitalOcean or AWS. But what we want to do is get rid of this service here that creates the SSL certificate. We want to run the NCA Toolkit locally, and we want to build it locally instead of using this here, which is the image that is pre-built on Docker Hub. And we want to integrate min.io with it. So let's start with that and just see how it does. Please take our existing Docker file and Docker Compose template in the Docker Compose MD file and rebuild a Docker compose.local YAML file that doesn't use Trafic because we are going to deploy this locally and don't need SSL, and also integrate min.io as a local provider for the S3 connection that we need for the NCA Toolkit, evaluate the sample env variables JSON for the S3 variables we need for min.io. Please review the code base before executing and let me know what questions or clarifications you need before we proceed. Then I want to create a plan to-do list before we start, and I want to approve it. One other thing, make sure not to use I'm going to explicitly tell it not to use this image because I'm on a Mac and this image is built for deploying on a PC. So I'm going to tell it to build the image locally. Make sure not to use the image from Docker, rebuild the image in the local version from the Docker file. All right, let's give it a go and see where it goes from here. So Claude Code now is just reviewing the system just so it has a better understanding of how everything is put together, which is awesome. If you're enjoying this video, make sure to like and subscribe. It tells me what type of content you want more of. And usually when I'm starting off a project, I usually like to start this way. Once I get going, I don't require it to make a plan or to-do list every time. When we first start to get going, I like to make sure we're on the same page first. So having it do this research and coming up with a to-do list and evaluating things is a really good way to get started. I probably should have mentioned it, and we'll see what it does, but we use a library called, I think it's Boto 3, which is the S3 library. It's looking for the US, and so it might not find it, but we'll see. Seems to think it knows what it's doing. Create the Docker local file, add min.io, cool. Create the environment, perfect. All right, so let's go ahead and look through the plan it came up with. Existing Docker Compose, S3 configuration, application supports, perfect. That's correct. It's going to create this new file. It's going to configure min.io through a local environment file that we can use with Docker Compose when we run it. It's going to build the Docker image locally, which is what I told it to do. Min.io integration. And now it's just asking me clarifying questions. So it's just asking me the bucket name. 1, that's fine. 2, min.io console. Should I expose the min.io web console on port 9001 for bucket management? Sure. 3, Data persistence, should min.io data persist between container restarts? Yes. So what it's basically saying is when we start and stop the system, should it keep all of the files that it created? And then for environment file, should I create? Yes. Also, please use the min.io image on Docker Hub or wherever the official image is. But remember, I'm on a Mac. All right, so now it's getting started. And then once it finishes up, it looks like it's going to document the local setup, which is perfect. This is why I like Claude Code quite a bit. So what it did is it created that Docker Compose local file. We'll go ahead and accept the changes. Now, one thing, if you were building this like I am here, you would need to make sure that you had Docker already installed on your computer. What I recommend using is the Docker desktop app. I'm going to go ahead and get that started up here. While this is working, it basically gives you Docker on the desktop so that you can use it graphically, and then it also makes it so that it works within your terminal as well. Do I want to make edits to the local? Yes. So it's creating that for me. Perfect. So it looks like it's making quick work of this project. We'll see how it actually works when we run it. And now it's giving us the local development setup instructions, which is cool. So here's our local Docker file. Let's take a look at it. So I created this storage volume, which I don't think we really need. These logs here, that's fine. I don't think it's going to matter. All right, so now what we can do is we can take a look at the README that explains how to use this. So basically you would start this up with a typical Docker Compose up command, which is traditional. We're going to be able to access the toolkit at this address and the min.io console at this address with this username and password. This is how you can view the logs when it's running. This is how you can stop the container. We need to create our environment variable, which should be referenced here, env local. Okay, so, and we have this local file here. Let's see if it's all configured. This is optional. I guess I'll just leave that as is, but I should probably remove that. I'll come back to that. Just come back to the README, data persistence. So what this is telling us is that in the Docker Compose file, in min.io, they set up a volume, and a volume is really just mapping a location inside the container to your hard drive, right? So we've got the container that's running, and min.io is in here, and it's got a place to write the files, and it's mapping that to your actual hard drive outside of the container. So that's what that's doing. And then it's setting up this network here so that min.io and the NCA Toolkit can communicate. I don't know that we have to have that. So if we have any issues, we can remove that. And then it looks like we've got this init process that we need to initiate maybe one time in order to set up min.io the first time. All right, so let's go ahead and give it a go. And then we'll just see if we have any errors. So we'll go back to the local README, and basically we need to just issue this command here. Jump over the terminal and let's give it a run. I'm always super curious how well this works the first time without any issue. So it downloaded min.io, the image, which is cool. And now it's building the local Docker image for Mac. This can take a little bit of time. There's quite a few things that have to be installed in the NCA Toolkit to get this up and running. So be patient while this runs. All right, looks like it's about finished here. So it says everything is started. Let's use this to look at the logs to see how things are running. We can see everything in the background. It would be pretty crazy if this whole thing is working perfectly as is. So let's just see. I'm seeing a warning here, but I don't know that that's an issue here. We see that the bucket was created. So we should be able to access min.io. Now here's the interesting thing is like I've never used min.io before here. So this is the tool that I learned about. Actually, that does not look like a port that is going to work. So I don't think that that is actually correct. I'm going to use the docs here. Let's say we can access it here, localhost. All right, there it is. And it said we would be able to access it through min.io admin, and here's the password, min.io admin, and the password. Let's go ahead and log in. Looks like it's working. Cool. Well, let's see if it works. I'm going to run the NCA Toolkit, open up Postman here. I'm going to go to my NCA Toolkit here. I'm going to create a new environment here, which is for local install plus min.io. And I have to create a variable here. So if I come to the toolkit test, we need the base URL, which is this here. So now when we go to the test, got to save it. Okay, that's working. Now I just got to get the authorization XAPI key. We got to add that. X-API-key. And I believe it made the password local dev key 123, and we'll save that. So now we can authenticate. Let's test that. Okay, that was successful. Now this is the big one here. Wow, it worked. That is crazy. Okay, well, we weren't able to actually access the file because I think this min.io domain that it's giving us back it's a domain, and we haven't defined that anywhere. Just intuitively, I'm going to replace it with this here, and then we can diagnose why it's returning that instead. Access denied. Okay. So we've got a few things to figure out. So I'm going to go back to Claude and just tell it what happened here. So I'm going to go to Claude and say, hey, we got this back. So I'm just basically saying, hey, we got back a URL that's not going to work. And then I say it should return a domain that we can access locally. Like, I'll just go ahead and put this in there so that it can help us. And then I'm just going to mention as well that even when we changed it, we were getting a permission denied to, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this part of it. But we did get an access denied. And then I'm just going to put in the error that we got. Please help us resolve these remaining issues. I will say this is pretty amazing that it even got this far. It means it was able to actually upload the file. We're not able to access it quite yet. So it's just investigating that now. Now we could probably put a entry into our own computer, into our local DNS that would help resolve that. Basically, this min.io is like a domain name. Like if you go to google.com, that's what that is simulating, except that this doesn't point to our local machine, and that's why we're having an issue. Now, one thing that I'm seeing that it's doing is that it's looking at our existing code to investigate how the URLs are generated. But I think that's going to be a mistake because it's the min.io service that's generating that URL and returning it back. Actually, one thing I'm going to do here, I am going to check this out. Does this work the same way? Yeah, see this, I did check that. It has an error. So let's see here. Fix the domain nation, use it directly on the URL construction, but that is set to this, internal Docker. Fix min.io, it needs to be set up correctly. Update endpoint for external access to fix the local host. Okay, so what it's saying here is that if we go to the local, got it. So it wants to correct that here, which should be fine. So basically what's happening here, just to explain, is that when you have Docker Compose, it's setting up this virtual machine, and we have the NCA Toolkit in here, NCA, and then we've got min.io. And what it's basically saying here is that inside here, these two are able to communicate, but we're outside here, and we're trying to access it from here. And so this URL doesn't work. So it wants to make a change to the env, and I'm okay with that, except I just want to say something. It's okay to change the S3 URL in .env local as long as it doesn't break the internal connection between the NCA Toolkit and min.io. So it looks like it's adding a public endpoint URL. So now it's trying to modify code inside of the NCA Toolkit itself. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't have to change the toolkit because basically it's trying to change the code of the toolkit, which is going to break everything for everyone else. So this is where Claude Code's going to start to do things, and you have to have the wherewithal to know when not to do that. So let's go down the path where it doesn't mess with that, and we'll sort it out. So basically it's not going to change everything for everyone else, and it's going to get it to work within the Docker container as it should. So that's where the experience with researching these tools as you go. Now, I might have more experience than you, I might have less, but as you go, you want to learn how these things are working. Don't just have it do stuff, and don't take a second, go to Claude, ask it to help you understand how things work. Okay, so now it says it's going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and take this down command. We'll stop the tail log and we'll do a down. So we're going to stop all the containers so that it can refresh. Grab the new one here, the new command. Actually, we don't really need to copy and paste it. I could have just gone back up and let's do the tail. Where did that go? There it is. Okay, so now it's created as public. All right, so now let's run this test again. Okay, so now let's open this up. Boom. Nice. Amazing. That's just crazy. To be able to do that is insane. All right, so now we've got the toolkit working locally with min.io and the S3 provider, the simulated S3 provider. So now it's running locally. We've got this working. Now what we want to do is expand the Docker container. So now we'll have S3, we'll have the NCA toolkit working in here, And then the other thing we want to do next is get N8N working here so we can deploy all of these things together and use the NCA Toolkit and N8N free. So back to our to-do list here. And I'm going to go ahead and make another to-do here, which is create a Docker file for cloud servers to use min.io as well. And the reason why I'm doing this is because there's a lot of people that do want to deploy the NCA Toolkit on the cloud, but they don't want to use an S3 provider and they're getting stuck. So we'll see how time goes, but I do want to get this working before we finish this video, but I want to get this done as well. All right, so we have the NCA Toolkit and min.io working locally. Now what we need to do is get N8N installed into this Docker file as well. So what's going to happen here is we're going to be able to just hit one command and it's going to load up the NCA Toolkit. It's going to load up min.io, and it's also going to install N8N. They're all going to be able to communicate with each other and work together, and we'll be able to build out our automations with the NCA Toolkit all for free. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm going to jump over to Docker installation, and hopefully this takes us right there. So we have the installation here, and this is the pure Docker instructions. I don't really want this. I think I'd rather start from a Docker compose file. So again, what this Docker compose file does, if you were to go into DigitalOcean or some cloud provider and you were to spin up a server and you were to log into that server, it's giving you the steps to install N8N. And the first thing you have to do is install Docker. So that's what this is doing here. It's got an optional step here, some DNS. It's telling you how to set up DNS because again, if you look at their compose file, you're going to see something familiar, right? We've got this same platform here that I had in this Docker compose file, which sets up the SSL certificate. So again, we don't need that. And we just need this part here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this whole compose file and I'm going to go to Claude and say, hey, here is the N8N Docker compose file for deploying this on the cloud, on the public cloud. Help me modify this. And again, remove the SSL image here that helps us set up the SSL certificate. Help me just install the N8N image and environment variables that we need so that we can run this locally inside of the Docker compose file that we just built and make sure everything can connect to each other and we can spin up N8N, log into it locally without SSL, and then actually execute the NCA Toolkit using min.io. All right, so I'm going to copy this compose file. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to open up my terminal. And I just always recommend that people do this. When you are using AI and you're building things out, when you have a success, go ahead and commit your files back into GitHub or back into Git so that you don't get into a spot where you make a bunch of changes and now it doesn't work again. So git add.env. I'm going to clean these files up a little bit more later and maybe rename them a bit. But until then, I want to make sure they are saved and good to go. And we'll commit created local NCA Toolkit install plus min.io. Perfect. I'm not going to push it to GitHub, but I have it locally from there. So let's go back to Visual Studio. Now it's working. Now what I need to do is add N8N to this Docker, to this local Docker compose file, again, without the SSL support. Use the official N8N Docker compose file to get the required information for setting up N8N, env variables, etc., and ensure the toolkit and N8N and min.io are able to interact with each other and connect with each other and ensure that N8N will boot up and install correctly on the first time. Here is the N8N Docker compose file. Pass that in. Please review. Ask me any clarifying questions. Do any research you need to do. Then present the plan. I can approve and we can get started. So it wants to just look at the instructions, which is totally cool. This was the original instructions that I was using, which is like if you're installing Docker from scratch, which we're not using, we're using the Docker compose. Remember when we went here, we originally were here which is what it just looked up, we use this, but it's good for it to have that context. Let's see what it comes back with, but we could also send it this as well. Actually, it's probably better that it looks at that. All right, now it's going to create the integration plan. If this works, I mean, it's just so insane what this stuff does, especially if you start to build up your knowledge of how these tools work. You'll run into fewer just endless loops. All right, so it came back with a plan here. Official ARM compatible, perfect. Port, standard N8N port, no SSL, perfect. Environment variables, no SSL. Webhook, security, data persistence. So it's going to create a volume for storing everything, services, communication, first run setup, auto initialize. So clarifying questions, what time zone should I set? Default UTC, we'll just let that be fine. File share, do you want the local files directory in the project root for easy access? I'm not sure what it means there. N8N version, should I use the latest? Yes. Database. So let's take a look at, it's asking us what database we want to use. And I want to see what, I wanted to come see, and it doesn't look like they use Postgres. So I'm going to ask a couple clarifying questions myself. So for one, that's fine. Two, what do you mean exactly? Can you explain the options and why they matter? Three, yes. Four, I don't see PostgreSQL in the N8N Docker Compose file I gave you, so I assume it's using SQLite. Whatever the Docker Compose file uses, we can use to keep it dead simple. One of the best things I like about Claude Code is that it lets me spell things incorrectly and it doesn't matter, usually at least. So let me explain the local files option. Local project root, local files. Docker manages the volume internally, harder to access files directly. Files stored in the Docker volumes, why it matters. N8N file nodes, and N8N has a read-write files from nodes. Easy access option A lets you drag and drop files directly into local files folder. Workflows, N8N can read CSVs, right? So basically it's saying, do we want to make it easy to access files? Recommendation, use option A, project root, because you can easily add files for N8N to process. Both N8N and the NCA Toolkit can access the same files. Simple file management for your Mac. So it's giving us this option here. I don't really know that I care. And also the NCA Toolkit writes everything to min.io, so there's not going to be any file sharing between the NCA Toolkit and N8N. So in this situation, it's one of those things where it starts to ask you questions and bring up a point that I don't really care about, and it's giving a recommendation. But really what I care about most about is that it's simple and it works and it does it the way it normally should, and not to create things that it doesn't need to. I want the most simple, straightforward, and normal install. So I'm just going to articulate that. So for the local files, I don't think I really care. What I do want is the most straightforward, tested approach that was provided in the N8N Docker Compose file that I gave you. The NCA Toolkit and N8N will not directly communicate on the file system, as the toolkit uses min.io to write files. So what I want is the most normal tested solution. What would that be? I bet it says option B. You're absolutely right. Looking at the N8N Docker files, the most normal tested solution is, this is the standard N8 approach. Cool. So it didn't really clarify, but it's just going for it. So let's do it. Let's make the changes. So now in our local file here, we should now have N8N. Perfect. It added in our environment variables. Yes. Yes. Go ahead and update the README file. We have the changes here. Yes. Cool. Let's put in a little architecture in here so we know how it works. It's pretty cool. All right, so it added it here. So now I could just run this just to see. All right, so what I'm just going to ask it is, can I just bring down the old compose file and then restart the new one without issue? Just want to ask. Yes, you can safely bring it down. So we'll just, we can use the commands that we already have here. So we'll bring it down, stopping the toolkit. We can stop the log. It automatically stopped anyway. And now let's bring it back up with N8N and let's see what happens. It's pulling the N8N container. So now what's interesting is like, this is all stuff I know how to do, but I don't do it every day. And if I were to sit down and do all this from scratch and go to all the docs, it would take me forever. But I'm just a couple hours in, or not even an hour in, and we're getting all this to work. So let's run the logs again, see if everything started up okay. So it looks like we might have used something wrong with N8N. We'll come back to that, but it does look like it started. And let's see if we can access it locally. Very cool. It's just telling us it's unsecured, which we know because it's localhost. Steven, is it going to tell us on that every time we put something? That'd be annoying. And we'll put in a password, localhost. That's fine. I'll have it send me this. I don't think we have to have it right now, but we have N8N working. Pretty cool locally. Now what we got to do is we have to run an HTTP call to the toolkit, see if it works. So HTTP, and we can import a curl command. So I'm going to come down here. We're going to go to test. Here's our curl command. Bring that in, import. Now let's execute. All right, so what happened here is it came back with an error. And now let's test this locally. Is it working? So that's still working, but for some reason it looks like N8N wasn't able to connect itself. Let's just double check everything. Now it could just be that there's a different URL that we're supposed to hit. So we know it's working, but for some reason inside the container, N8N wasn't able to connect to it. So we'll just explain what happened. So I was able to test the NCA Toolkit from my browser and it worked. But this URL did not work from within N8N itself. Any ideas? The issue is that from within the container, it needs to use the internal address. So from N8N, it's asking us to use this. From browser, okay, that's fine. Not really an issue. Let's just swap this out and see if it works. Perfect. Nice. Now, the only issue that I'm seeing here is that my guess is if this URL didn't work here, the old URL with localhost, that if we try to download this from within N8N, it won't work. So let's give that a try. Let's just do a HTTP. I know it'll work from here because we already tested that. So that works, right? It was just able to download that. So perfect. Inside N8N, if we try to do HTTP and we just get that file, my guess is that it says that it's not available. Yeah. So let's talk to Claude about that. Now, actually, let me just test this real quick though. Let me change it to min.io. If I change this to min.io, is it able to find it? Boom, yeah, it is. So let's just talk to Claude about that issue and then we'll be done. So we updated the Docker Compose so that we could access the toolkit at localhost. So then it worked for using it on my Mac, but now inside the container, the files that the toolkit returns are also referencing localhost, which N8N can't access. Is there a super simple way that both localhost works inside N8N and also on my computer? Or what do you suggest we do? So let's just figure out what the situation is and what our options are. So the NCA Toolkit is generating the files using which works for your Mac, but not inside the container. Two simple solutions. Option one, used host.docker internal recommended. Change the S3 endpoint in env to use Docker special hostname. This works from both your Mac and the container. Interesting. Option two, use min.io's external alias. Okay, cool. Option one sounds the best. So it's going to allow us to use these URLs that work from the computer and also from inside the container itself. Actually, before it changes anything, I'm going to commit this. Git status, git add.env, local, readme, local, and Docker compose. Compose local, git commit added N8N local. Now we'll do the changes. It's just good to have that all committed. So if this starts going off some random spot, then we'll be able to finish it. All right. So now what we need to do is bring it down. Then we run the drum roll again to see if everything works, and then bring it back up again. And then let's take a look at the log files, make sure everything looks good. All right, it says from the Mac, we can access this. Let's see if that works. The toolkit itself. Let's see if this file still works in the browser. Definitely not working locally. Let's see if it works inside of the container. Nope. Let's run this again. So that worked, but this is not working. I see. So it's a slightly different URL here. All right. So it's working internally, but this, actually it's what it's saying is I use this. Okay, let's see. So it's a slightly different URL. I see. Just got to pay attention to exactly what it says. Actually, I'm just going to paste this in there. All right. You're right. Works from within. From your Mac, use this. Let's just see if it works. Okay, it didn't work. I think I was accessing it from a different URL before. Here's the object store. Let's see what it's having us use here. Download. So it's working from min.io. I see browser. Got it. So now here it's saying the NCA Toolkit is generating URLs which only work inside the container. So basically what I've found here is that the NCA Toolkit does work from localhost, so it's working. But the response for the file either needs to be something that works in my browser, or it needs to be something that works inside of N8N. And what it's proposing here is it wants to have two different URLs, one that works with the browser and one that works with N8N. So it's going to go back into the toolkit and make a change, which I don't really want. So I'm just going to ask it. I don't really want to change the toolkit. So if it's a matter of it working within N8N or my browser, just to keep it simple for now, I'm just going to pick N8N. That's what we really wanted here. So you're right to ask. See, you got to know, like sometimes AI is just going to go off. Easy without, since N8N works from your Mac and N8N, let's just keep as N, let N8N access files by calling the NCA Toolkit APIs instead of accessing it. No, we don't want to do that either. So sometimes AI is going to give you suggestions to try to satisfy what you want, even though it's going to create a worse situation. I don't really care that it works in my browser and N8N. I'm not willing to just start destroying everything to make that happen. It's not really that important to me. I really want it to work within N8N. That's the whole point of this. So from that standpoint, I'm just going to let it exist as it is because it works fine within N8N. And that was what I really wanted. So let's just come back here. Let's save this, make sure it's working in N8N. Works. And then the URL coming out of the toolkit. So instead of using this hard-coded URL, let's use the one that comes here. Execute, work. Perfect. So let's leave it as is. And then down the line, if there's a compelling reason, and again, the toolkit does work locally on my Mac, so I can access it. It's just this URL that's responding, is that this URL is coming from inside of the container. And so if I were to change the URL here, we would be able to access the file. And there might be an easy way to get around that. In fact, I could probably just add a host name to my computer that would allow me to access this. But it's not that important to me. It's not worth spending hours trying to go back and forth. The objective that we wanted is complete. And so now we have N8N running locally with the NCA toolkit, and we can access the files. So I'm just going back and just making sure I remember exactly where we're at. So we didn't make any additional file changes after this. So if I come back to the terminal here and look at the status, let's see what the difference that we have here is. And just so I know, I'm going to ask Claude, remind me what this was doing. Again, I always just encourage people, do research. It's going to be hard to remember and learn all of these different things, but if you ask questions, you're going to pick these things up. That change made it so the NCA toolkit can resolve. Got it. So we don't actually want that. So now when we revert this change, what that's going to do is it's going to make it so when we look at the status of Git, it'll have no changes here once it finishes. So now see, this is where you have to be careful. So we didn't want to revert that. That actually made it work. We wanted to revert this here. Now we're getting confused. I want to be able to use and not access the files from local host. So I'll go ahead and use the AI to revert this back, see if it remembers. Otherwise, I'm just going to go and make sure it's back to normal on my own. So I'm not sure I need that. So let's just go ahead and test that. Let's take it back down and then bring it back up again. and do another round of testing just to make sure we're in a good state, and then we'll call it a day. And while it's doing that, if you remember, I did want to do this. I'm going to do this in another video. And basically what I'm going to do there is make sure that we can have another Docker Compose file that will install the NCA Toolkit, this time on the cloud. So we do need the SSL certificate. So we're going to have that other image in there that creates that and serves up so that we can go through the NCA Toolkit with the lock because we're on the public cloud. But instead of using the S3 services from DigitalOcean, we're going to use min.io instead. So we're basically going to create another Docker file that's a little bit different than these, but for the cloud with SSL. So it's just like another version of what we just built. So let's go back to our code real quick, and then let's bring it back up again. Let's make sure everything is working. Let's take a look at the logs. Let's make sure we can run it from localhost. So that's working, perfect. Can still call the toolkit from my computer, and I should be able to run this as well. Boom, boom, boom. Get the internal URL for the file, and the file was able to download. Perfect. We're good to go. Now, if you're interested in learning how to vibe code, make sure to jump into my new community. We've got a special deal since it's new, but the price increases at 200 members. It's an active group, and inside the community, we're going to be building a community SaaS framework that allows you to rapidly build out your own SaaS product. And we're also putting together an AI API framework that allows you to launch your own AI APIs to the public. I'd love to see you in the community either way. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on the next one.